Episode number 5.
The Pentagon's Sub-Level 3 briefing room hummed with the low vibration of classified conversations as America's most lethal operators filed in for what they knew would be another impossible mission. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen entered last, her boots silent against the polished concrete floor, despite the tactical gear that would have made lesser soldiers clank like walking armories. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who had learned that noise meant death, and death was something she had become intimately familiar with. Admiral Marcus Steele stood at the head of the room, his chest heavy with ribbons that told stories of 3 decades in special operations. Behind him, a massive screen displayed satellite imagery of a compound in the Syrian desert, its walls casting long shadows in the infrared spectrum. The men around the table represented the apex of American military might. Delta Force operators whose faces never appeared in photographs, Navy SEALs who had redefined the meaning of impossible, and Marine raiders who treated suicide missions as routine Tuesday assignments. Chen took her seat at the far end of the table, noting how the conversations died as she passed. She had grown accustomed to the silence that followed her presence. Some attributed it to her being one of the few women in these briefings. Others whispered about the missions that had earned her a place at this table. But Chen knew the truth was simpler and more terrifying. They could sense what she had become. "Gentlemen," Admiral Steele began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had sent thousands of men into harm's way and brought most of them home. "And lady," he added with a slight nod toward Chen, though his tone suggested the courtesy was purely procedural. "Operation Nightfall is a go. We have a CIA asset, codenamed Prometheus, captured 72 hours ago during a reconnaissance mission in Syrian territory controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps." The screen shifted to show a photograph of a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying temples. Dr. Marcus Webb, officially a humanitarian aid coordinator, actually our primary intelligence asset in the region. He's been feeding us information about Iranian weapons shipments for the past 18 months. His capture compromises not just his life, but potentially dozens of other assets throughout the Middle East. Chen studied the compound layout as Steele continued his briefing. The facility was a fortress, 3-story concrete structure surrounded by 20-foot walls, guard towers at each corner, and what appeared to be a kill zone of open ground extending 200 meters in every direction. It was the kind of place designed to be impregnable, which meant it was exactly the kind of place they would be expected to penetrate. "Intelligence suggests they're planning to move him within 48 hours to a more secure facility in Tehran," Steele continued. "Once he's there, he's gone forever. This is our only window." He clicked to the next slide, showing team assignments. Alpha Team will be led by Commander Rodriguez, Bravo Team by Commander Jackson, and Charlie Team. His eyes found Chen's file on the podium. "Charlie Team will be led by Lieutenant Commander Chen, callsign." Steele paused, his eyebrows raising as he read the designation. A slow smile spread across his weathered features, the kind of expression that preceded the type of military humor that could end careers. "Iron Widow." The silence in the room shifted from respectful attention to something electric. Chen felt every pair of eyes turn toward her as Admiral Steele's smile widened into a grin that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with mockery. "Iron Widow," he repeated, his voice carrying across the room like a challenge. "Well, that's certainly dramatic." A few chuckles rippled through the assembled operators. "What's next in the callsign department? Death Princess, Doom Queen. Maybe we should start issuing tiaras with our tactical gear." The chuckles grew louder. Commander Rodriguez, a barrel-chested SEAL with arms like tree trunks, slapped the table. "I vote for Skull Duchess," he called out, earning more laughter. "Or maybe Black Widow wasn't intimidating enough, so we had to upgrade to Iron." Chen remained perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her expression unchanged. But something in her eyes shifted, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure drops and every animal instinct screams danger. "Permission to speak, Admiral." Her voice was quiet, controlled, but it cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. "Oh, by all means, Lieutenant Commander," Steele said, still grinning. "Please enlighten us about your fearsome call sign. Did you choose it yourself, or did someone think you needed something more theatrical?" Chen stood slowly, her movement so fluid it seemed choreographed. The laughter died as she stepped away from her chair, her boots now deliberately audible against the floor. Each step echoed in the sudden silence like a countdown. "Permission to demonstrate, sir." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Admiral Steele's grin faltered slightly as he registered something in Chen's tone that his 3 decades of combat experience recognized as genuinely dangerous. "Demonstrate what exactly?" "How call signs are earned, Admiral. Not given, not chosen, earned." Before Steele could respond, Chen moved. Her motion was so fast that most of the operators didn't see the beginning, only the result. Commander Rodriguez, who had been reaching for his coffee cup, suddenly found himself yanked from his chair, his arm twisted behind his back in a joint lock that would shatter his elbow if Chen applied another pound of pressure. His face was pressed against the table, his 220 pounds of muscle rendered completely helpless by a woman who weighed 60 pounds less than him. But it wasn't the speed or the technique that made the room go dead silent. It was what Chen whispered in Rodriguez's ear, her voice so quiet that only he could hear it, but loud enough that everyone could see his face go from red with embarrassment to white with terror. "The last man who laughed at my call sign," she whispered, her lips barely moving, "begged me to kill him before I was finished. I didn't grant that mercy. Would you like to know what I did to him instead?" Rodriguez's eyes went wide, and for a moment, every operator in the room saw something they had never seen before. One of their own, a man who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless classified operations, genuinely afraid. Chen held the position for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary, then released Rodriguez and stepped back to attention. The commander slumped back into his chair, unconsciously rubbing his arm, his eyes never leaving Chen's face. "Iron Widow earned, not given, Admiral," she said, her voice returning to its previous professional tone as if nothing had happened. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Admiral Steele found himself looking at Chen with new eyes, noting details he had missed before. The way she held herself wasn't just military bearing, it was the posture of someone who had learned that relaxation meant death. The scars visible above her collar weren't from training accidents. They were too precise, too deliberate. And her eyes held something that Steele had seen only in the faces of men who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "I see," he said finally, his voice considerably more subdued. "Well then, Lieutenant Commander Chen, perhaps you'd care to share with the class how exactly one earns such a distinctive call sign." Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes like lightning in storm clouds. "Classified, sir, above your clearance level." The statement hit the room like a physical blow. Admiral Steele had clearance levels that most generals could only dream of. For a lieutenant commander to claim information above his access was either career suicide or a statement of fact so classified that it existed in the shadows beyond normal military hierarchy. "Above my clearance level," Steele repeated slowly. "Yes, sir, Operation Lazarus, Kandahar Province, 2019. If you need details, I suggest you contact Director Morrison at Langley. He can explain what parts of my service record exist and what parts." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "What parts never happened?" The mention of the CIA director's name sent another ripple of tension through the room. Operations that required direct CIA oversight weren't the kind that appeared in official records or earned traditional commendations. They were the kind that left operators changed in ways that couldn't be measured or healed. Commander Jackson, a Delta Force veteran with 20 years of experience, leaned forward slightly. "Lazarus," he said quietly, "I heard whispers, something about a team that went dark for 6 days and came back. Different." Chen's gaze shifted to Jackson, and he immediately regretted speaking. "Not different, Commander. Reduced. From 12 operators to 1. The mathematics of survival are quite simple when you understand the variables." "And those variables are?" Admiral Steele asked, his earlier mockery completely absent. "Pain tolerance, resource management, and the willingness to become something that can survive when everything human has been stripped away." Chen's voice remained perfectly level, as if she were discussing weather patterns rather than psychological transformation. "Iron doesn't bend, Admiral. It doesn't break. It doesn't feel. When everything else fails, iron endures." The room had become so quiet that the ventilation system seemed loud. Every operator present had faced death, had made impossible choices, had done things that would haunt civilian nightmares. But something in Chen's tone suggested she had traveled to places that even they couldn't imagine. "The widow part?" Rodriguez asked quietly, his voice still shaky. Chen turned to look at him, and he immediately wished he hadn't asked. "Widows are created by loss, Commander, but iron widows are forged by what they do with that loss. The question isn't what I lost. The question is what I became when I decided that loss would never happen again." Admiral Steele found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the woman standing before him. Her file had been impressive but not unprecedented. Top marks in every training program, commendations for valor, rapid promotion through the ranks. But files didn't capture the reality of what stood before him now. This wasn't just another special operations officer. This was something that had been broken and rebuilt into a weapon that could think. "Very well, Lieutenant Commander," he said finally. "Charlie team is yours. Your mission parameters are simple. Infiltrate the compound, locate and extract Dr. Webb, eliminate any threats to mission success. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. Collateral damage is acceptable if it ensures mission completion." Chen nodded once. "Understood, sir. Will there be anything else?" "Just one thing," Steele said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "Why Iron Widow? Why not something more traditional?" For the first time since entering the room, Chen's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something that might have been one in another life, on another person. "Because, Admiral, when you've been dead and decided to come back, you need a name that reminds everyone, including yourself, that some things are harder to kill than others. Iron doesn't rust when it's been properly tempered. And widows," she paused, her eyes scanning the room one final time. "Widows have nothing left to lose, which makes them the most dangerous thing on any battlefield." She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps once again silent despite her gear. As she reached the threshold, she paused without turning around. "The mission briefing mentioned 48 hours until they move the asset," she said. "I'll have him back in 12. Iron Widow out." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving behind a room full of America's most elite warriors who suddenly understood that they had just met something that existed in a category entirely its own. Admiral Steele stared at the closed door for a long moment before turning back to his remaining officers. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I believe we may have just witnessed the difference between soldiers who fight wars and soldiers who end them." The Syrian desert stretched endlessly under a moonless sky, its silence broken only by the whisper of wind across ancient sand. At 200 hours, 3 Black Hawks swept low across the terrain, their rotors muffled by classified sound-dampening technology that made them ghosts against the star-filled darkness. Inside the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen sat motionless, her eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation, but was actually something far more dangerous: the mental preparation of someone who had learned to weaponize her own psychology. The other members of Charlie team shifted nervously in their seats. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a Force Recon Marine with 2 Purple Hearts, kept glancing at Chen as if she might suddenly explode. Petty Officer First Class David Kim, a SEAL sniper with 43 confirmed kills, found himself checking and rechecking his equipment despite having performed the same ritual 3 times already. Chief Warrant Officer James Wright, a Delta Force breacher who could open any door known to man, sat rigid with the kind of tension that came from being in the presence of something unpredictable. They had all heard the stories now. After Chen's demonstration in the briefing room, the whispers had spread through the Special Operations community like wildfire. Operation Lazarus, the team that went dark. The sole survivor who came back changed. But whispers were one thing. Sitting 3 feet away from the reality was something else entirely. 2 minutes to insertion, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Chen's eyes opened, and Torres felt his breath catch. In the red glow of the cabin lighting, her gaze held the kind of emptiness that he had seen only in the eyes of men who had killed so many times that death had become routine. But there was something else there too, something that made his combat-hardened instincts scream warnings. "Final equipment check," Chen said, her voice cutting through the helicopter's noise with surgical precision. "Remember, this is a surgical extraction. We go in quiet, we get our asset, we leave. No heroes, no unnecessary risks. The mission is the only thing that matters." Kim nodded, adjusting his rifle scope. "Rules of engagement. Weapons free on any hostile contact. But understand this." Chen's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than a shout. "If this goes loud, it goes very loud very fast. The compound has approximately 40 defenders and they know we're coming. They just don't know when or how." Wright frowned. "Intel said they might suspect a rescue attempt, but how can you be sure they know?" Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes like heat lightning. "Because Dr. Webb has been feeding them information for 6 hours. They broke him yesterday morning." The statement hit the team like a physical blow. Torres felt his stomach drop. "Then this is a trap," Chen finished. "Yes, Admiral Steele knows, Command knows we're going anyway." "Why?" Kim demanded, his sniper's instincts screaming that walking into a known trap violated every principle of tactical operations. Chen turned to look at him, and Kim immediately regretted asking. "Because sometimes the trap is the mission, petty officer. Sometimes you don't go in to avoid the ambush. Sometimes you go in to become the ambush." The helicopter began its descent, and Chen stood with fluid grace despite the aircraft's movement. "Dr. Webb is already dead. Has been for 12 hours. What we're extracting is the intelligence he died protecting, and what we're eliminating is the cell that thinks they've won a victory." Torres stared at her. "You're talking about a massacre." "I'm talking about mathematics," Chen replied, checking her sidearm with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. 40 hostiles who think they're hunters. 4 operators who know their prey. The equation only works if the prey becomes the predator. 1 minute to insertion, the pilot announced. Chen moved to the helicopter's door, her hand resting on the fast rope attachment. "Listen carefully. When we hit the ground, you follow my lead exactly. No improvisation, no initiative, no heroics. You do what I say when I say it without question or hesitation. Is that understood?" The 3 operators nodded, though Wright couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to follow someone into hell. "Good," Chen said, and for the first time since Torres had met her, she smiled. It was the most terrifying expression he had ever seen on a human face. "Because hell is about to learn why they call me Iron Widow." The helicopter flared over the compound, and Chen was first on the rope, descending into darkness with the silence of falling snow. The others followed, their boots touching Syrian sand 30 seconds later as the Black Hawk disappeared into the night sky. The compound loomed before them, its walls casting geometric shadows in the starlight. Chen held up a closed fist, and the team froze as she tilted her head, listening to sounds that existed below the threshold of normal hearing. After 30 seconds, she pointed toward the eastern wall and began moving. They covered the 200 meters of open ground like ghosts, using a combination of natural depressions and Chen's seemingly supernatural ability to find paths that avoided the guard tower's overlapping fields of fire. Torres found himself wondering how she could possibly know the exact timing of the sentry's patrol patterns, until he realized she wasn't avoiding them. She was herding his team along a route that would bring them into contact with the guards at precisely the right moment. The first sentry died without making a sound. Chen materialized behind him like smoke, one hand covering his mouth while the other drove a blade between his ribs with surgical precision. She lowered the body gently to the ground, then gestured for Kim to take the guard tower. The sniper moved like liquid shadow, scaling the tower's exterior ladder with movements so controlled that the metal didn't even creak. 30 seconds later, his voice whispered through their comms. "Tower 1 secure. I count 6 additional sentries, 2 roving patrols, and what looks like a command post on the second floor of the main building." "Copy," Chen replied, her voice so quiet it was barely audible even through their headsets. "Right, you're on the main entrance. Torres, you're with me. We're going through the kitchen." They moved through the compound like a plague, silent and inexorable. Chen led Torres through a maze of service corridors and storage rooms, her navigation so precise that he began to suspect she had been here before. When he whispered the question, her response chilled him to the bone. "I haven't been here," she said without turning around. "But I've been in 100 places exactly like it. They're all the same once you understand the psychology of the people who build them." They reached the kitchen, and Chen paused at the door, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond human perception. After a moment, she held up 3 fingers, then pointed to positions around the room. Torres nodded, understanding that 3 hostiles waited beyond the door. Chen's entry was a masterpiece of violence. She flowed through the doorway like water, her movements so fluid that the first guard was dead before he realized she was there. The second guard managed to raise his weapon before Chen's blade opened his throat. The third guard actually got off a shot, but Chen had already moved, and the bullet passed through empty air while her return strike ended his life. The gunshot echoed through the compound like thunder. "So much for stealth," Torres muttered, but Chen was already moving toward the stairs. "Stealth was never the plan," she replied, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Torres' blood run cold. "Stealth was the setup." The compound erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed from every direction as guards rushed toward the kitchen. Chen reached the stairwell and paused, her hand on the rail, as if savoring the moment. "All teams, this is Iron Widow," she said into her comm, her voice suddenly different, colder, more distant, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. "Going dark." She reached up and switched off her radio, then looked at Torres with eyes that no longer seemed entirely human. "From this point forward," she said, "you follow or you die. There is no middle ground." The next 18 minutes redefined Torres' understanding of what human beings were capable of. Chen moved through the compound like a force of nature, appearing and disappearing with supernatural timing. She seemed to know where every guard would be before they knew it themselves, setting up ambushes that turned the defenders' superior numbers into a liability. Torres found himself swept along in her wake, firing when she indicated targets, moving when she gestured, becoming part of a killing machine that operated with clockwork precision. But it was Chen who did the real work. Chen who turned corners at exactly the right moment to catch guards in crossfire. Chen who appeared behind enemy positions like a nightmare made flesh. Chen who moved through the compound's defenders like death itself. In the command post, Torres watched her interrogate the cell leader with methods that would have made CIA interrogators uncomfortable. She didn't torture him. Torture implied emotion, anger, the desire to cause pain. What Chen did was clinical, surgical, the systematic application of pressure until the man's will broke like glass. Dr. Webb's intelligence, she said, her voice carrying no more emotion than if she were ordering coffee. Where is it? The man babbled in Arabic, then English, then Arabic again, his words tumbling over each other in his desperation to make the pain stop. Chen listened with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, occasionally asking clarifying questions in perfect Arabic that made Tors realize there were depths to her training that he couldn't even guess at. When she had what she needed, she ended the man's life with the same clinical precision she had used to extract the information. No anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all, just the completion of a necessary task. Intel secured, she said, pocketing an encrypted drive. Compound neutralized, time to go. Tors looked around the command post, then out the window at the courtyard below. Bodies lay scattered across the compound like broken dolls, 37 men who had been alive 18 minutes ago and were now just obstacles to be stepped over. Jesus Christ, he whispered, what are you? Chen paused at the window, looking out at her handiwork with the same expression someone might use to evaluate a completed crossword puzzle. I'm what happens, she said quietly, when someone decides that losing is not an option and is willing to pay any price to ensure victory. She turned to look at him, and Tors saw something in her eyes that made him understand why the other operators had gone silent in the briefing room. I'm what you become when you realize that the only difference between a hero and a monster is which side wins the war. She activated her radio and her voice returned to its previous professional tone. Command, this is Iron Widow. Compound secured. Package retrieved. Requesting immediate extraction. Admiral Steele's voice crackled through the comm, tight with disbelief. Iron Widow, confirmed status. We're showing 37 enemy casualties and 0 friendly losses. Confirmed command, mission complete, Iron Widow out. As they waited for extraction, Tors found himself staring at Chen, trying to reconcile the professional officer who had briefed them with the force of nature he had just witnessed. She sat calmly on a crate, cleaning her weapons with the same methodical precision she had used to kill, as if the last 18 minutes had been nothing more than routine maintenance. How, he finally asked. Chen looked up from her rifle, her expression almost curious. How what, Sergeant? How do you do it? How do you become that? Chen considered the question for a long moment, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. You die, she said finally, completely. Everything you were, everything you thought you were, everything you hoped to be. You let it all burn away until there's nothing left but the mission and the will to complete it. She resumed cleaning her weapon. And then you discover that what emerges from those ashes is something that can't be killed, can't be stopped, and can't be reasoned with. Something that exists for one purpose only. Which is? Chen's smile returned, and Tors felt his blood turn to ice water. To ensure that the people who created the necessity for such a thing never, ever do it again. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the night air, and Chen stood, shouldering her gear with movements that had become as natural as breathing. Time to go home, Sergeant, she said. The mission is complete. But as Tors followed her toward the extraction point, he couldn't shake the feeling that for Iron Widow, the mission was never really complete. It just moved to the next target. The Pentagon's medical bay hummed with the sterile efficiency of military healthcare at 800 hours, 3 days after Operation Nightfall's completion. Staff Sergeant Mike Tors sat on an examination table, his hands trembling slightly as a Navy corpsman checked his blood pressure for the 3rd time. The numbers weren't improving. Elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure, signs of acute stress response, the corpsman muttered, making notes on his tablet. When did you last sleep, Sergeant? Tors stared at the white wall, seeing not medical equipment but the courtyard of a Syrian compound littered with bodies. Sleep isn't really an option right now, Doc. The corpsman frowned. The mission was 3 days ago. You should be experiencing some normalization by now. Have you considered speaking with? No, Tor's response was sharp enough to make the corpsman step back. No counselors, no debriefing sessions, no talking about feelings. What Tors couldn't explain was that every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Not the professional officer who had sat in the briefing room, not even the lethal operative who had led them through the compound. He saw something else entirely, something that had worn Sarah Chen's face while systematically dismantling 37 human beings with the emotional investment of someone organizing a filing cabinet. The door opened and Admiral Marcus Steele entered, his expression grim. "Sergeant Tors, how are you holding up?" Tors looked at the Admiral, nodding, the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. "About as well as you are, sir, which is to say, not particularly well." Steele nodded, dismissing the corpsman with a gesture. When they were alone, he pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. "I've been reading the after-action reports. All of them. Yours, Kim's, Wright's. Even the preliminary analysis from the intelligence Chen extracted. And I'm beginning to understand that I may have made a serious error in judgment." Steele rubbed his temples. "Tell me about the compound, Sergeant, not the official version, the real version." Tors was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenching and unclenching as he relived memories that felt more like nightmares. "She knew, sir. Before we even landed, she knew exactly how it was going to play out, not just tactically, psychologically. She understood those men better than they understood themselves." "Explain." "The way she moved through that compound. It wasn't like she was adapting to the situation. It was like she had written the situation. Every guard position, every response pattern, every tactical decision they made, she had already accounted for it." Tors met Steele's eyes. "Sir, I've been in special operations for 12 years. I've worked with the best operators in the world. What I saw in that compound wasn't special operations. It was something else entirely." Steele leaned forward. "Something else how?" "She didn't just kill those men, Admiral. She orchestrated their deaths. The whole thing was like watching a conductor lead a symphony, except the music was violence and the instruments were human lives." Tor's voice dropped to a whisper. "And she enjoyed it. Not the killing, the control. The absolute, perfect control over every variable in a chaotic situation." Before Steele could respond, his aide knocked and entered. "Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Chen is here for her debriefing." Steele and Tors exchanged glances. "Send her in," Steele said. Chen entered the medical bay with the same fluid grace she had displayed in Syria, her uniform immaculate, her bearing perfect. But Tors noticed something different about her eyes. They seemed more present, more human than they had been in the compound. As if whatever had taken control of her during the mission had retreated back into whatever psychological depths it normally inhabited. "Admiral, Sergeant Tors," she nodded to each of them. "I understand you wanted to discuss the mission." "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander," Steele said, his voice carrying none of the mockery it had held 3 days earlier. "I have some questions." Chen remained standing. "I prefer to stand, sir. What would you like to know?" Steele pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several documents. "According to your report, you eliminated 37 hostiles in 18 minutes. That's an average of 1 kill every 29 seconds, sustained over nearly 20 minutes, while moving through an unfamiliar compound under hostile fire." "That's correct, sir." "The intelligence analysis of the data you extracted shows that the terrorist cell had been planning a coordinated attack on 3 American embassies. Your mission didn't just rescue an asset. It prevented what could have been hundreds of American casualties." "Also correct, sir." Steele looked up from his tablet. "What I want to know, Lieutenant Commander, is how you knew. How you knew it was a trap, how you knew the compound layout, how you knew exactly where to find the intelligence we needed." Chen was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting between Steele and Tors. When she spoke, Her voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. Because I've been in that compound before, Admiral, not physically but psychologically. I've been in the minds of men like those terrorists. I understand how they think, how they plan, how they react under pressure. She paused. I understand because I've become something very similar to them. Explain. Chen moved to the window, looking out at the Pentagon's courtyard where uniformed personnel went about their daily routines. Kandahar, 2019. Operation Lazarus. My team was tasked with eliminating a Taliban cell that had been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. Intelligence was wrong. It wasn't a cell. It was a full company, nearly 200 fighters. Torres felt his breath catch. He had heard whispers about Lazarus, but never the full story. We were compromised before we even reached the target, Chen continued, her voice taking on the flat, emotionless tone Torres remembered from the compound. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. Standard protocol would have been to call for extraction, accept the mission failure, live to fight another day. But you didn't, Steele said quietly. No, sir, because among the intelligence we were supposed to retrieve was information about a planned attack on a school in Kabul. 300 children. Chen turned from the window, and Torres saw something in her eyes that made him understand why the other operators had gone silent in the briefing room. My husband, Lieutenant Commander David Chen, was the team leader. He made the decision to proceed with the mission despite the odds. She moved back to the center of the room, her movements precise and controlled. The Taliban captured us 6 hours after insertion. They spent the next 18 hours demonstrating what happens to American soldiers who interfere with their operations. They made me watch as they tortured and executed my entire team, one by one, saving my husband for last. The medical bay had become so quiet that the ventilation system seemed deafening. Torres found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell was keeping Chen talking. They kept me alive because they wanted information about other operations. They thought a woman would break faster than the men. Chen's smile was the most terrifying expression Torres had ever seen. They were wrong, not because I was stronger, but because watching them kill my husband had killed something in me that they didn't understand couldn't be tortured. What happened next? Steele asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. I waited. For 6 hours I played dead among the bodies of my team while they celebrated their victory. I listened to them plan the school attack, memorized their voices, their faces, their habits. And when night fell, Chen paused, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. When night fell, I became something that could survive what they had done to me. Torres realized he was gripping the edge of the examination table hard enough to leave marks. You killed them all. All 197 of them, Chen confirmed. It took me 14 hours. I used their own weapons, their own tactics, their own psychology against them. I became the thing they feared most, an enemy who understood them completely and felt nothing while destroying them. She moved to stand directly in front of Admiral Steele, and Torres saw the older man struggle not to lean back in his chair. That's when they started calling me Iron Widow, Admiral. Not because I was strong, but because I had been forged in fire and loss into something that couldn't be broken, couldn't be reasoned with, and couldn't be stopped. Iron doesn't bend. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't forgive. And widows, she paused, her eyes holding Steele's with an intensity that made him visibly uncomfortable. Widows have nothing left to lose, which makes them the most dangerous thing on any battlefield. Steele cleared his throat. The school attack never happened. The intelligence I retrieved led to the elimination of 3 other cells and the prevention of 17 separate attacks over the following 6 months. Chen's voice returned to its professional tone. The mission was a complete success. At what cost? Torres asked quietly. Chen turned to look at him, and he immediately regretted speaking. The cost. Sergeant was everything I used to be. Sarah Chen, The woman who joined the Navy to serve her country and protect innocent people died in that compound in Kandahar. What came back was something else, something designed for a single purpose. Which is to ensure that people like those Taliban fighters, like the terrorists in Syria, like anyone who thinks they can use violence against innocents to achieve their goals, understand that there are consequences, permanent consequences. Chen moved toward the door. I am those consequences, Admiral. I am what happens when someone crosses a line that should never be crossed. Admiral Steele stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. Lieutenant Commander, I owe you an apology. When I mocked your call sign, I was operating under the assumption that it was chosen for dramatic effect. I now understand that it was earned through experiences that I can barely comprehend. Chen paused at the door. Apology accepted, sir. But understand this, Iron Widow isn't just my call sign. It's a warning. To enemies, to allies, to anyone who might be tempted to underestimate what someone is capable of when they have nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I have a proposition for you, Steele said. There's a new unit being formed. Highly classified, maximum autonomy missions that require specialized approaches to problem solving. Interested? Chen considered the offer for a moment. What kind of problems? The kind that can't be solved through conventional military operations. The kind that require someone who understands the psychology of our enemies better than they understand themselves. The kind that require someone who can become whatever the mission demands. Tors watched Chen's expression change, saw something predatory flicker behind her eyes. I'm listening. Unit designation, Omega Protocol, mission parameters, elimination of high-value targets that pose existential threats to American interests, rules of engagement, whatever is necessary to ensure mission success. Steele handed her a classified folder. You would have complete operational autonomy and access to any resources you deem necessary. Chen opened the folder and scanned the contents, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she closed it and looked up at Steele. When do I start? Immediately. Your first target is an arms dealer in Montenegro who's been supplying weapons to terrorist cells across Eastern Europe. Intelligence suggests he's planning to sell chemical weapons to a group planning an attack on the London Underground. Chen nodded once. Consider it handled. As she turned to leave, Tors called out, Commander, what happens when there are no more targets, when all the threats have been eliminated? Chen paused without turning around, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. That's the thing about being Iron Widow, Sergeant. There are always more targets. There are always more threats. There are always more people who need to learn that some lines should never be crossed. She looked back over her shoulder, and Tors saw something in her eyes that made him understand that Sarah Chen, the woman, was truly gone. And there's always someone who needs to teach them that lesson. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Tors and Admiral Steele alone in the medical bay. Jesus Christ, Tors whispered, what have we created? Steele stared at the closed door for a long moment before responding. We didn't create anything, Sergeant. We just gave a name and a purpose to something that was forged in hell and decided to come back. He stood and moved toward the door. The question isn't what we've created. The question is whether we can control it. As Tors sat alone in the medical bay, he couldn't shake the feeling that Admiral Steele was asking the wrong question entirely. The real question wasn't whether they could control Iron Widow. The real question was whether they should. Because somewhere in the depths of the Pentagon, in an office that didn't officially exist, Sarah Chen was already planning her next mission. And somewhere in Montenegro, an arms dealer was about to learn why some call signs weren't chosen. They were earned in blood and forged in fire. Iron Widow was hunting again.